This show is listener supported. You can join us and help our show grow to support more adoptees by going to adopteeson.com/partner. You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 167, Emily. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Happy New Year! Hi, friend. It's our first show back of 2021, and I am so glad to be here with you, recording for you. I had a really mostly nice break with my family over the holiday season, and with the exception of recording for Patreon, I just vanished from social, and it was just really beautiful. It was a gift to myself to just focus on my family. And so thank you for that. I will be back showing up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all those normal places. And so if you want to connect with me there, I am at Adoptees On in almost everywhere. Anyway, I'm so excited to share the first interview of 2021 with you. Emily N. Bartz is our guest today, and I love this conversation. It runs the gamut. We start with her personal story of being adopted from the Philippines, and then why she spent her childhood going back and forth between the U.S. and her country of origin. We have a fascinating discussion about adoptees in comics, including a focus on her article about Loki, quote, "I can turn into anything as long as it's me," end quote, and about adoptees in academics and how much is available for us to learn from academic journals in particular. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Emily Bartz. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody for listening.
I'd love it if you would start the way we usually do, and would you share your story with us?
My name is Emily N. Bartz. I was born on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. My family was poor. My mother was widowed, and she had 4 other children, and she was caring for her sickly father. So, not a great start. I was relinquished on the day of my birth and sent to an orphanage in Bukidnon, Philippines. The only effect I can think had on my Filipino family was that when I reunited with my eldest brother, he said he remembers my mother coming home from the hospital with no baby, and he knew what that meant, and stuff like that. And it was really, really tough for him. I was apparently quite popular at that orphanage because they never receive a newborn. Like, if you look at my adoption papers, it's like, born September 23, relinquished September 23. It's like very quick. I was adopted at 8 months old to the United States by a family from North Dakota, Minnesota. It was a really rural town in Minnesota. They had one other son, a domestic adoptee about 3 years older than me. And then when I was 16 months old, they became Christian missionaries in Christian radio in the Philippines. So I returned to the Philippines to the northern island of Luzon, which is like, Luzon is the northernmost, Mindanao is the southernmost, which is a generalization. And that's where I lived for the first 16 years of my life. When you're a missionary kid, as we're called, you live in the foreign country. So I lived in the Philippines for 4 years, and then I would come back to America for maybe a year, 6 months, and go to school in America. I went to public school for 7th grade for a year. That was interesting. But most of my education was in the Philippines at a school for missionary children. In 2nd grade, I got to go back to visit the orphanage and meet the staff. And that was really eye-opening. That was really fun. I got to meet a lot of the people who cared for me, and they remembered me. I got to see the room that I stayed in, and I got to meet other children who were there. But I didn't really pursue the idea of tracing one's roots back past that. First, because I lived in a very conservative Christian household that had, like, if you searched for anything, it would send that to your parents. So I didn't want to be, like, Googling things on our computer that would be, my parents would find out, because I considered family search very personal thing. Like, that's not even something that's your adoptive parents' business, even if they feel invested in it. That was just my personal feeling about it.
So they had like this internet tracker thing that would highlight for them everything that you'd gone through.
Yeah, we had it. Yeah, we had an internet tracker that was for like, making sure you didn't access pornography or like things you're not supposed to look at on the internet. Back when people cared about, not accessing weird parts of the internet, but I just considered it I considered it a really private matter. Like, I didn't talk even with my adopted brother very often about what it meant to be adopted or how we felt about that. And so I just didn't. Also, when you're a missionary kid, because of the sort of public face of your parents, there's sort of a tendency, and just in the environment that I was growing up in, there's a tendency that if you share something because you in trust with somebody, they might share it with other people so they can pray for you. And I didn't want anybody praying for me about that. I didn't really like that. So I just kept it very much to myself. And if I was ever asked about, what have you thought about it? I'd be like, nope. And inside I'd be like, I am, but I don't, no idea how, if I do not know how to do this and there's no way of finding out, and I wasn't smart enough to think you could Google this on school computers. I was not smart enough to think that up. I just didn't. But when I graduated from high school and I moved to America, I got my own, you get your own laptop to go to college. That was great. And that's when I started searching online for like adoption, search, how to find family, questions like that. And at that time, the most that you could probably find in 2006 internet was mostly stuff about domestic adoption searches. And so I learned the lingo, like what a search angel was. This was before we had DNA or public listings of records online that you could search. That was in the very early expensive stages. So I mainly just met people. And as Facebook expanded, I joined groups for adoptees and I sort of found other Filipino adoptees because there aren't that many Filipino adoptees. It's not as large a diaspora as perhaps other countries. So I met other adoptees and I met a few who had found their families, but they had used private means and that looked kind of expensive to me. I didn't really find a suitable and affordable means until about 2015. I was on the ICAB Philippines website. I think ICAB means like something Council Adoption Board, International something Adoption Board. And it looked like they just copied and pasted the law onto this page. And then at the very bottom, it said, email us at adoption@icab.gov.ph for more information. So I was like, okay. And I sent an email to them saying, hello, I'm a Filipino adoptee. I would like to find my family. And I believe you provide post-adoption services. Is that something I can use? And then they said, okay, send us your case study, which I did have. And then I didn't hear very much from them. They said they were going to coordinate with the orphanage I was from. And then I heard nothing from them. And then I sent up a follow-up email about, I want to say 2 years later, because I didn't want to be pushy. I felt like I didn't quite have it in my head that post-adoption services was a right. And I really do. And now I feel like post-adoption services is definitely a right that every adoptee has. And if they want to use them, they should definitely use them. And they should be quite insistent about using them because people worked very hard to give me these rights. But I waited 2 years. And then I emailed them and said, hi, any update? And they said, well, we heard nothing back from the orphanage. So what we're going to do is send your case over to the local Department of Social Work in Mindanao. And they will send out a private investigator. To go look for your family. Do you have any other information you could send us? And So, and I didn't really have anything else, but
they asked you to send them information.
Well, this is another part of the problem. I also contacted the adoption agency in America for my information and for help. And they basically pointed me back to ICAB. And then they said they didn't have any of my stuff, which was a bit weird. So that was not. So it was like a whole passing the buck. But like the people who were definitely on it, I would say, were ICAB Philippines. They just needed to be like reminded, which I imagine they were quite busy. So.
And just to press pause for you. So you're doing this search completely independent. Like you didn't ask your American parents, for example, like, hey, can you give me any files, paperwork, stuff that you have?
No, I think the first time they heard about it is when I kind of whined on Facebook about it. I said I was kind of thinking about how long it was taking them. And like I was just sitting there not, asking for updates. And I kind of posted on Facebook, how long should I be waiting? Is 2 years too long? And then it was very interesting, the reactions that I got. People who were not adopted were telling me I should be calling them every 24 hours to ask for an update. And then the adoptees were like, I think actually emailing them every 2 months, every 3, to just keep them on their toes because, they probably have a lot of other things they're working on. That's more reasonable. But I thought it was interesting that people who were not adopted were much more insistent that I should be more insistent and and people who were adopted were like, yeah, I get why you don't want to be a burden, but you really should. So that was an interesting difference.
No kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. Then in April 2018, I got an email from them saying that they had found my Filipino mother and my siblings. Only 3 were still alive. I think I missed one of my siblings by a few years, which, darn it. But they said, would you like to write a letter? And I said, sure. And then I had to write the letter, which as somebody who studies English rhetoric is the weirdest genre of letter. It's well, hello, we haven't met in 30 years. How's it going? So I read a lot of other people's. Some people have posted what they either wanted to write to their mother or what they would desire to say to them or what they've actually written. And so I went online and I read a lot of their letters. And I think because I'm very much bottle everything in, I was like, I'm just going to put the facts. And then I was trying to think of what kind of effect that I wanted my letter to have. And I thought, knowing a little bit about the circumstances and how it was just a pile-on of terrible things, I didn't want my family to regret that this had happened. So I framed the letter very just the facts, but I also listed a lot of my accomplishments just so they would feel like this wasn't a terrible thing that happened. And that was sort of the rhetorical approach that I took was, I just want you to know about my life. I grew up. I went to college. I got married. I went to graduate school. I'm still in graduate school. It's really tough. I didn't say that it was tough, but just like, I'm going to get a PhD. I knew my mother didn't get to go very far in her education. So I really, really wanted her to know how far like this family, our biological line could go if given the opportunity or something like that. So I tried to frame it that way of like, and put pictures of me and my partner and my family and my dog of sort of key moments. I had a picture of my high school graduation. I think I had a picture of me doing, and this is funny because my family, my Filipino family is from the southern Philippines, but I was raised in the northern Philippines. So a lot of this cultural stuff I do is very northern Filipino. I think I put a picture of me doing this dance called tinikling, which is like you dance between moving sticks and stuff like that. And just to sort of like give her an idea, I didn't completely lose the culture. I got my ankles hurt trying to learn this dance and stuff like that. I did Filipino Arnis in high school. So I learned Filipino martial arts that is being revived because it was suppressed during the Spanish colonization. And it's just getting really, really, really revived. See, I've done stuff that despite the fact we've been apart, I've been able to hold on to the culture and be proud of me. I don't know what I really wanted, but I just wanted them to not feel bad. And I think I ended up at about 5 pages with little photos in there, which I think is succinct.
Oh, well, how do you sum up a lifetime? I mean,
yeah,
5 pages.
Also, how do you start that letter well, hi there. It's been a long time.
Well,
anyway,
and we've got how many adoptees spend hours and hours perfecting these letters? Then you have the added rhetoric piece that's reading this as a focused in on that. And we didn't mention this, but missionary kids, pastors' kids, very much this pressure to be perfect and good and appear. Yes. Appearances must be 100% all the time because you're a reflection on your adoptive parents. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of pressure I see here, Emily.
Yeah. And also the added problem of my family doesn't speak fluent English. They speak, I would say, a mixture of English and a language called Visayan. And I speak Tagalog, which is a northernish kind of, it's sort of one of the, there's a lot of official languages in the Philippines, and they're all a little similar, but some are intelligible, but we work through it. So there was the added thing of, I want to write this in simple enough English that I don't know how far they went in school, but I want them to be able to understand. So short, simple sentences and not trying to make it sound too American or use any phrases that would be very culturally American. Yeah. So it is a really tough document for, I think, anyone to write. And we should do more research on this because I think it would be easier to write a constitution for a country than it is to write one of those letters. Yeah.
Wow. That's a big statement. That's very interesting. So you finally were like, hey, this is it. I've come to the place where I feel like this is an acceptable letter.
Yeah. And then I sent that. And then I had put in the letter my Facebook address. And one thing, I don't know when they did this, but Facebook in recent years let you put previous names you've had, maiden names, and birth names. So for many years, my one way of kind of hoping maybe they would Google me was I put my birth name in my profile, public-facing profile. Because there's many Emily Bartzes in this world. And I wanted to make sure if they were looking, they would be like, oh, that's super easy. That one. It's that one because her name matches this. So I had put my Facebook address in there, and I had put in, and I guess my sister found me and was like, yep, definitely her. And then friended me. And so my first sort of contact, I guess, would be direct beyond that letter was with my sister via Facebook Messenger. And then about a week later, she drove to my Filipino mother's house and was able to contact me on, well, not really the phone because it was through Facebook Messenger, but voice over the phone, voice over chat. And that's how I spoke to my Filipino mother for the first time. And I always feel a little lucky sometimes because I think a lot of adoptees down the line, they talk about how they wish they could have gotten a very sincere apology from their mothers. And the very first thing she said was, I'm so sorry. And I was like, I didn't know how to respond. But she was that was the first thing she said. She says, I'm so sorry. And I was, that this happened. And I was like, I was trying to figure out something very kind to say back. And I said, I know how your life was before it happened, and I understand. And I think you made the best choice that you could with the information that you had at the time. If I had been in her situation, I would be like, I don't know what I would have done. It was a lot. She had so much on her plate. And so then we had a brief chat, and new pandemic, because I was going to visit the Philippines this year.
No.
I was going to a wedding in Japan, and then we were going to take a brief sojourn down to the Philippines if we had some time. But no. Oh, well. there's always next year, right?
Of course.
But yeah, I went through, and I will say, like, when the shutdown happened, I don't know why, but my immediate reaction was to watch every sad adoptee movie. and then have like a big self-pitying cry about the fact that I was going to get I wasn't even going to get that moment, or even like the sad moment in like, I can't remember the name of that movie. The one where she goes to find her son in America, but she finds out he's dead and buried in Ireland. I can't remember. You don't even get that moment where she gets to go to the grave. I was like, this isn't fair. So I had a self-pitying cry. Oh. And then I was like, or you could calm down, because the world is going through much worse than you are right now. So you should just, calm down, Emily. And then, that's how I calmed down. And so I mostly am in contact with my siblings through email or Facebook Messenger. And that's the main way we sort of talk and stuff like that. I chat with my eldest brother and my sister quite frequently. Yeah.
How much older are they than you? Because you would be the youngest.
Yes, I'm the youngest of 5. I believe my eldest brother is in his 40s. And then the youngest, my sister, is just probably a few years older than I am. Yeah. And they all have families, and I have nieces and nephews and stuff like that. I have seen my nieces and nephews a few times on like video chat, very grainy video chat. Yeah.
Okay, so something that is extremely interesting to me, and I had no idea this about your story, is that your American family literally moved you back to your country of origin. And you said you grew up in a totally different culture because it's northern versus southern where you were born. And what is that like for you? Like, do you feel like, well, I mean, at least I got to stay connected to my culture in some fashion? Or was the Christian missionary thing like a big factor? I don't know. I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit, because I feel like that's very unusual. I know we've got adoptees that are would consider themselves international adoptees or transnational or interracial adoptees that were adopted in their country of origin and stayed there. But to go back and forth, that's really a very different kind of experience.
I know about 3 other people who were Filipino adoptees, but growing up being missionary kids in the Philippines. And we never really talked about how weird it was. Like, for me personally, Filipinos can see me from a mile away. They know I'm not one of them. At the same time, so there's sort of 3 levels. First, there's colorism. I'll talk about colorism. So I'm very brown. I'm less brown than I was when I was growing up in the Philippines, and the Philippines has colorism. So I experienced things like people following me around in stores with my white American friends because they thought I was going to steal something. And like, no, I don't want anything in your store. If anything, that white American's going to steal something, and because he's very, very good at running very fast. I don't know. So there's colorism and that kind of thing. There was always a feeling that I stood out a lot. If anything, the thing I was most anxious about was when I would be in public and my father looks like Chuck Norris. And I know this because he's been in several countries and people have mistaken him for being Chuck Norris. He is not Chuck Norris, by the way, but he looks like Chuck Norris.
Okay.
And people think he is. And I worry that people think that me standing next to this blonde man, they think I'm his young Filipino mistress. Or even worse, when I would be standing with my brother, who's 3 years older than me, but he's a white Minnesotan man, that he would think I was like his little mistress or something like that. I'm like, no, this is my brother. And I would always be like, I think that's why I think very rhetorically about the effects that, like, well, this is how I'm standing as my brother. That's how people know that he's my brother, not my boyfriend. Is my brother, guys. And so there was always kind of that awkwardness. I remember being really, really worried as a child that if I got lost in this shopping center called Green Hills, that I would go to the lost place, the place you go for lost if you get lost. And then my father would show up or my mother would show up and they wouldn't give me back to them. because they wouldn't believe him, because adoption is something that is so rare in the Philippines that when I was doing my test to go up a level in Filipino martial arts, the guy who was supposed to be testing me wasn't looking at me. He was quizzing my parents at how this could be possible that they were my parents. And I was sitting there very nervous, trying to do all this right, while also listening to this guy say, so wait, how does this work out? I don't understand. She's your kid? And I would get very, very sensitive about that. So there was the whole idea of like your own people knowing you're not one of them, but not really understanding why you're with them. And then I think when you're a missionary kid at an international school for missionary children, there would be subtle little microaggressions against Filipinos, and you didn't know if they were referring to you or not because they would say them in your presence and you thought they were nice people. But if they felt it was okay to say rude things about Filipinos while you're sitting there and you're like, guys, I'm Filipino, you know that, right? But you wouldn't say it. You're just going to go, you kind of give them a glance, and you don't know. You sometimes would wonder how people thought about you, considering I'm Filipino, but I'm not Filipino. I'm a missionary kid serving in the country that, like, why are we trying to convert my people? They're all Catholics, guys. They know who Jesus is. I don't understand what exactly while we're here. So I was always a little confused. I will say, I guess I got called racial slurs slightly less frequently because I was in the Philippines. But like when I would live in the United States, we lived in a very small rural white town where I'm sure there was more than this, but I feel like saying that the only diversity came from the adopted children. The church I went to, there were 3 Asian kids, and we were all adopted, 2 from Korea and then me. And so I think that tells you a bit about how diverse the place was. Like, my nickname in 7th grade was Asian Emily because there was many Emilys, but only one Asian Emily.
Oh, boy. Oh, yikes. Yeah.
Which, you know, they could have thought of something worse to call me because I did have braces and glasses, I guess. So, and I had it could have been worse. But yeah, yeah. So you get the whole sort of, you don't belong here no matter where you go. But also you're like, I would like to speak to the manager.
Okay. This is, I don't know why this question is stuck in my head, and I don't even know if you can answer it. Did you have a preference growing up? Because you were going back and forth, you know, I'm assuming when your parents were on furlough, that's when they were back to the States. Mm-hmm. Did you have a preference of where you lived? Like, did you feel safer in one place versus the other, just as a person, or at home one place or the other?
Well, in the Philippines, I had a lot more freedom to move around, and there was public transportation, and there were things to go do with friends without. I could go to the mall and go to the theater in Metro Manila and take public transport to get there and back again, and not have to ask my parents for a drive because the movie theater because the town I lived in America was very small. I had one theater, and I think it was just a projector. And I think the screen, like nowadays, if you go into a hall, the projector screen would be much bigger. It was just a very small town. And when I would live in America, I would live in very small towns in America, or medium-sized towns, I guess. So I always I think I preferred the Philippines. I will say the variety of cereals and the quality of television in America is great. And so
when you're a kid, that goes a long way.
When you're a kid, you're like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay. Well, thank you for indulging me. I don't know. I just find that really fascinating. Okay. I could go on to your story for like hours. I really, really want to get to your academic work. And this is why I contacted you. You wrote this really fascinating article about Loki in comics and his identity as a late discovery adoptee, as an angry adoptee. There's a few different things that you identify about Loki. So can we switch gears and kind of talk about that? some of the things you bring up in your article are just like adoptees in comics. And, I feel like so many times we can just become this like trope, but you pull out some really, really fascinating things. So I'd love for you to kind of give us some of the things you've learned, or even start with like, why were you even interested in this particular story, and how did you focus in on this for your article?
So I love comic books. I didn't read them much when I was a kid, but when I went to college, I was looking for the comedy section. I ended up wandering into the comic book section because I didn't understand the Library of Congress organization system that colleges have. And I was just, oh my goodness, there's like 3 bookshelves of collected comic books of, the last 50 to 70 years. And I was so excited. And because I was a lonely, rather pathetic person at college, I would basically, if you can imagine Gus Gus in Cinderella when he stacks the cheese, that's how many books I would take out of the library every Friday, take back to my dorm room, say goodbye to my dorm roommate because she would be going home to visit her family, and then I would sit and read comic books all weekend. I would bring them into the cafeteria to read because I would sit by myself. And then so in between doing homework and practicing and stuff like that. And so I would just read a lot of comic books. I would read other books as well. I had a well-rounded academic career, but it was a lot of comic books. And in comics, there's a lot of adoptees and orphans and foundlings and complicated family dynamics and a plurality of identity for one person. So for instance, Superman, first appearance, Action Comics #1, 1938. Sometime in 1938, nobody can agree when. But if you read the very first comic, he is a former foster youth. In the first page, it is established his spaceship landed on Earth. He ended up in a orphanage or a foster home of some sort. There's a picture of like him as a baby, like picking up something heavy. I want to say it was like a chair, like a toddler holding a chair above his head. And then like horrified foster parents being like, what? Oh my goodness. Wow, you can do this. And then it said, he grew up in American values in this foster home. And then when he came to adulthood, he decided to support truth, justice, and American way. I don't think they used that phrase in the first comics. They may have. It's been a while since I've read it. But he was a former foster youth for many years. And then along came the more familiar story that most people probably listening to this podcast recognize, which is he crashes in Kansas. Mom, Pa, Kent take him in and raise him in American Kansas values. And then that's not a good Kansas accent. And then he becomes, Superman. And I thought that was really interesting how I think that was in the 1950s that transition happened. And I thought, why did we do that? And I guess it's because I think at some point we need to go back to Superman being a former foster youth to give former foster youth someone to look up to. But he's now considered one of the most iconic adoptees. And I think Superman probably is one of the most selling comic book characters. If you look at the top best-selling comic book characters, you've got Batman, who's being raised by his butler. I'm not sure how that works. I think it's a guardianship, bro. I think it's a guardianship.
Yep.
Over at Marvel, we have Spider-Man. He's a kinship adoptee. We never hear about his parents. They once tried to launch it in the movies, him having parents that he had feelings about, but they never get brought up. His heroic motivation is from a deep personal relationship with his uncle who passed away, and he has a loving relationship with his aunt. Wonder Woman, depending on the circumstances, she seems to have a slight working relationship with her mother. They may have not seen each other in a while. Depending on who her father is, or if she even has a father, she either hates him or has a very distant relationship with him. So you have this. My personal favorite is Scott Free, Mr. Miracle, who was traded between 2 planets, 2 like kings of planets. And he's an escape artist. He's the god of escape, which I always think as an adoptee is an interesting thing. He's the god of escape, and he is Mr. Miracle, and he's an adoptee. And he has a very complicated relationship with Highfather, his father, and Darkseid, who is his adoptive father, and who, as you can imagine by the name, wasn't the nicest guy in the universe. So, you have a lot of these adoptees in comics. And I've wrestled with trying to figure out. And then you have someone like Loki, who is a supervillain. And there's a lot of supervillains and villains who come through who either were in foster care or were somehow touched by the child welfare services at some point. So you have this genre, you might say, this art form where adoptees are quite common. And I think it's partially to put an extraordinary person in with very ordinary people, like Superman with Ma and Pa Kent. And then you have to kind of deal with your fears about this extraordinary person. And then like, well, maybe if this extraordinary person has ordinary people values, that will somehow, that makes him okay. And then sort of inversely, you have a character like, and not completely inversely, you have a character like Loki, who is complicated. He is from Jotunheim, but he doesn't look anything like it. It's coded as like a birth defect. Like his father is like 20 stories tall and blue. They make the size difference a little smaller in the movie, but in the comics, there's a part where his father ate him. Long story. But he's like the size of an NMM compared to his father. That's the size difference. And he's not blue, and he doesn't have jagged teeth, and he looks like an Asgardian, and he's been raised by Asgardians, and he acts like an Asgardian a lot. And there's a lot of tension there with his character. And what I really, really liked about Loki is, particularly in Al Ewing's 17-issue series, Loki, Agent of Asgard, is he really, really delved into identity and how that could happen and how one can explore the complicated feelings that an adoptee might have about who they are. And I think I decided to write an article about it when I saw the phrase, he's trying to break into some sort of place in Vegas or something, and his sidekick said, why don't you just turn into a fly and go through the lock? And he said, I'm not very fly-like. I can turn into anything as long as it's me. And I felt that really in my core, because I was like, being an adoptee makes you feel like there's so many different types of people in you. And you feel like you're constantly wrestling with those, like who you are to this person, who you are to that person. And I think people who are not adopted can relate to that as well. But because I was watching an adopted character and him making that statement, I really, really connected to that. And I wanted to wrestle with that and what that had implications for in that text. Yeah.
I have so many different parts of your article highlighted, and it's incredible to me the insights you've pulled out as an adopted person looking at Loki. And I mean, it's really amazing. And I have never read comic books in that way. I've heard about Loki just from like the traditional mythology sort of stories. Mm-hmm. So not necessarily read about him in this fashion. And when you pull out so many different parts of their story, it's really, really, I don't know, so many insights. That's what I was like, oh my gosh, she's like digging into like the adoptee's psyche through a comic book character, which is really neat. A couple of the things that I thought was really interesting, I'd never heard this term retconned, the retroactive continuity. And mm-hmm. you explain it a little bit in your article, but I was wondering if you can define that for us. And then when I was reading that, I thought, oh my goodness, how many parts of us as adopted people do we kind of do that to? Mm-hmm. Looking back, my question won't make sense until you explain what retcon means, I think.
So retcon is when so like I said, with Superman, he used to be a former foster youth. It was established in Action Comics #1 in 1938. He's a former foster youth who grew up and decided to become a journalist and fight for truth, justice, and the American way as Superman. And then sometime, I want to say in the 1950s, they reestablished that he crashed to Earth and was raised by Ma and Pa Kent, and he was adopted, and he grew up on a farm rather than in New York City. That's another thing. Yeah. So they ruralized him, I guess. Yeah. So retcon is when you go back and rewrite a character's history and establish that is now the truth. So for instance, Loki, a lot of characters in comic books, the first time you see them, they just show up And they're like, hi, I'm here to cause trouble, or hi, I'm here to save and assist. And so you don't really know who they are. And eventually they have to go and tell the story. Batman used to carry a gun. Now we've decided Batman doesn't do guns at all. And that's like his firm line in the sand. But we go back and we establish what a character's origin story is. But then sometimes we go back and we decide that the origin story, we don't want that one anymore. Sometimes maybe culturally in the 1950s, they decided Superman as a former foster youth wasn't going to make him as sympathetic. That makes me sad. But like, so he had to be an adoptee now. Maybe somebody wanted to have fun. Another thing is these characters, they can be owned by different people. You hire different writers and artists to draw them in certain ways. So these characters are passed around. We could go very meta about adoption in comic books and that these characters aren't actually, they're owned by like a master company and they get passed around to different writers and people get to decide what to do with them and what they're going to do with this character. But retcon, you go back and you rewrite their origin story. And in Loki, he was originally from Olympus, and then they decided he was going to be the adoptive younger brother of Thor. In fact, I'm not even entirely certain that he's the younger brother. It's kind of ambiguous whether or not Thor or Loki was born first. And those more familiar with the movies, he's definitely the younger brother. But you can see these. It's been for I would say about the last 70 years. He's been our iconic angry adoptee, running around in green and gold, being like, it's not fair. I don't know why I did this. I went back and read all the huge volumes of Thor and Journey into Mystery to try to like figure out how this character evolved. And he basically went from my chief motivation is I want to be king to somewhere in the 80s, 90s being my chief motivation is I want to be king because I'm upset because I'm adopted and you didn't tell me. So I should be king. I don't know how that logic works, but that's what it is now. It's like, yeah.
Can I read a line to you from your article?
Sure.
It says, through Loki, agent of Asgard, argues that being adopted does not cause the wound. Instead, it is the expectation of submission to a narrative told about oneself without one's voice that makes villains of adoptees. Do you have any comments on that?
I think particularly in comic books, and especially in Loki's case, and in Agent of Asgard, it's really wrestling with what is it like to have a story told about you that you're not in the room to tell. I always felt very uncomfortable growing up when anybody else tried to tell the story of me because I always felt I think maybe because there's so much of your story that you control. And I feel sometimes when I was growing up, I was grasping for like, no, this is my part. Just grasping for it and trying to figure it out. That I really felt like it wasn't owned by me and people were telling stories of me. And I didn't feel that was comfortable. And what I liked in Loki Agent of Asgard is it's about story and it's about telling your own story and about establishing yourself as the storyteller of your own story. Loki is the god of lies because, as everybody else seems to think, he lies a lot. But what really it's because he's been lied to his entire life. And if you've been lied to your entire life, you're going to end up with probably, and this is one of those, and we like the supervillain and we understand his perspective. But if you've been lied to a lot in your life, then you're going to end up lying a lot. And the funny thing is, he's the god. He decides, I don't want to be a liar anymore. I don't want that to be my story. I'm going to be the god of stories, because perhaps in a way that a lie is in opposition to the truth. Stories offer for a multiplicity of truths that make up the truth. And he wanted to move himself that way. And I thought that was really, really, really powerful. And I really appreciated that like a character in a story was able to sort of do that and do that through language. He's like, I am no longer the god of lies. I'm the god of stories. I've established this. You may no longer call me that. That's who I am. And I think as for adoptees, that's really important. It's a really important lesson to learn about telling your stories, which I think is why there's so many people online telling their stories in sort of like adoptee Twitter, because that's what's important. It goes into the whole danger of a single story as well. And that if you've only got one story and then you come up with a story and it's not the same, then they call you a liar, but you're like, no, you may think that's my story, but from my perspective, it's this. Yeah.
Well, that's why I think that even just that word, the retcon thing, like I didn't really know that happened in comics and talking about other people changing your story. But if you're the one changing your story and what you see as the truth of what's happened to you, there's so many layers in here that you talk about, the expectations of our adoptive families to kind of fit in, for Loki to bend to the new culture that he's in, when really he's kind of parts of both and doesn't really fit either. And there's so many different layers that I think people will be able to, suss out for themselves when they read your article. So the other two terms that you bring up, rhetorical sovereignty and rhetorical imperialism. And I thought those things were so interesting. And especially when we're looking at our stories and just what you were explaining, you like lies versus storytelling, or what's our truth. I thought those were really interesting for adoptees to think about.
Yeah. So rhetorical sovereignty, I was very lucky to be able to take a Native American literature course when I was in graduate school. And I learned about rhetorical sovereignty there. And rhetorical sovereignty, and the example I give in the text, is about how when Native American children were taken away to residential schools, they were given, chalkboard, slates and chalk to write on. And the first thing they used that slate and chalk for was to draw their homes. And so they were using tools given to them to remind them of where they came from, and the whole importance of literacy in being able to preserve where you came from, even though you can see literacy is a colonizing thing. It's important to be able to learn language in order to be able to speak back. And that's what I really liked. And it made me think really deeply about how adoptees struggle sometimes. And I'm very interested in adopted language. I love learning new adoptee lingo. I think I learned the word cribmate and the sort of people's differing feelings about that word a few years ago. And like, I love the lingo that we have in adoptee circles.
You mentioned in your article, attributed to Kimberly McKee, adoptee killjoy. I'd never heard that one.
That's a good one. She wrote a great article. You should check it out. And a book. Yeah, she wrote a book. Great. You should check that one out. Learning language is very important in order to defend and perhaps fight back against language that has been used to describe you. I think that's essential. And in Loki, Agent of Asgard, that's what he really does. He uses language to free himself from the language that caged him in as the god of lies, as a bad guy, as a supervillain, as someone who stands in opposition to Thor. The big supervillain tends to be the exact opposite of the superhero. And it was really interesting to watch a sort of supervillain decide, you know what? I don't want to be the opposite of you. Like, I think maybe even one way to perhaps free adoptees is to perhaps, instead of we always put ourselves in opposition to people who are not adopted, is to just try to find another way, perhaps. But that's just sort of like me talking off the top of my head. I'm always interested in having a multiplicity of ways of being over binaries. I love it when anybody can sort of kind of do that in narrative, because it makes me think really hard.
Well, I want to give you an opportunity to address some language that you told me that you don't really appreciate before we do our recommended resources, because I know you are this very, very fascinated by language. And one of the terms we use on the show so many times is coming out of the fog, or I don't think I use this term very often. I may have, but I've seen other adoptees call adoptees fogged adoptees. So can you tell us your comments on that, your thoughts on that before we do our recommended resources?
I think the phrase bugs me on like 3 levels. First, on a geography level, fog isn't that bad. Except unless you're operating a like motor vehicle or trying to get somewhere, fog is kind of nice. And I think on a geography level, I'm like, but then on sort of like, maybe because I come from a very conservative evangelical background, the term coming out of the fog had a very I once was blind, but now I see evangelical-esque kind of term to it. I think because of it, it kind of rubbed me in the wrong direction, as if people who don't see adoption from the same perspective as you, they're not at the same place that you are at, or something like that. Or they don't know the super secret handshake, that they're fogged, like they're stuck, they're lost, and then they need to be told so that they can know better and then come out of the fog of something for some reason. So it has like religious overtones to me that always bothered me. I have a theory that it comes from poetics. Like, I have a feeling there's a poem out there that describes coming out of the fog and to describe how they felt as they came to terms with adoption and their adoption, perhaps. And maybe that's why it sounds the way it does to my ear, because it comes from poetics, and I'm trying to apply non-poetic logic to it. But I think it can set up a problematic binary that makes those who disagree with us feel lesser. But there's so many people I know who feel like, oh, that describes how I felt. I felt like I was in a fog. And then once I found a community of people who would tell me that I'm not wrong to feel these things, that I felt like I came out of a fog and I could see the light of day. And I'm like, oh, no, that's great. I just worry, like when we talk about prescriptive adoptive languages, like positive adoption language, like that was just kind of like invented by one lady a long time ago. And then it somehow became standard. And I worry. And then people are like, that doesn't describe how I feel. We should update this. And I feel like eventually we'll update it and find another word. But I always get a little worried that when we use fogged and coming out of the fog, that it sets up a problematic binary that makes people feel left out. And I don't want them to feel left out, because like, that's where you're at. Here's where I'm at, plurality of perspectives and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate you calling our attention to that. And the other thing is it also makes things so linear when we talk about grief and the 5 stages of grief or whatever. And that's, debunked now. Like if you diagram grief, you can just look at a big scribble on a page, you're going back and forth and back and forth. And I think similarly, the adoptee journey, especially someone who is looking at the impact of adoption on themselves critically and maybe through a trauma lens or looking at it from a psychological perspective, it's not linear either. And so, I like that I do like a nice foggy day myself. So thank you for making those notes for us. Okay, Emily, I could talk to you literally for more and more hours, but I want to do recommended resources. And I want to let people know about the Adoption and Culture Journal. And so your article that we dove into the tiptoe just briefly into, I can turn into anything as long as it's me, the adoptee god goddess of lies and stories in Loki, agent of Asgard, Emily N. Bartz. You can find that in Adoption and Culture, Volume 8, Number 1, Visual Adoptions 2020. And I really want to encourage people to do some more academic reading about adoption. The Adoption and Culture Journal is so very well done. When we're releasing this episode, they will have just closed their call for proposals. And I see that they're working on one about adoptees in film, and how interesting, adoption in film, how interesting. It's so amazing to me, the in-depth work that it takes to write an article like this. I'm a little scared to ask you how long it took you to write a piece like this, because as you heard Emily talk, she knows her stuff. She can name, the exact edition of a comic that she found inspiration from for part of the article. you're talking about hours and hours and hours, maybe years of work culminating into an academic article like this. And so you are gaining so many insights from reading a piece like this. And the other thing, I don't know if you do this, Emily, you probably do. The other thing I really like about reading articles from a publication like this is, you're citing all your sources. And so if you want to dive into more of the topic and Emily hasn't published her other work on this yet, you can go back and look in her bibliography and see all of her sources, and you can go and read other articles that are on theme. And so it's kind of like this open door to like access all more information, especially about adoption and looking at it critically from a critical lens. And do you have anything you want to add about selling people on reading academic articles about adoption? We read blog posts all the time, but I think some people are a little bit scared of looking to a journal. Can be a little bit intimidating sometimes. The language is a little bit more challenging, I would say. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we have great editors, but I would really encourage anybody who wants to do work in this area, definitely submit something. We definitely will read it and we will consider it, and we'll probably and offer feedback, constructive feedback. I think it's super important for there to be more research in this area. And adoption studies is sort of like a formalized, we have an organization, is really, really important. When I was in my master's degree study, I wanted to write about adoption in medieval literature, and I was told I couldn't write about it because I was too close to the topic because I was an adopted person. And to quote Michael Jordan, I took that personally, and so I made my entire PhD career about adoption. So if you are at all interested, or even just in trying to write something, you don't have to be degreed yet. We accept any kind of academic article. We'll definitely look at it. I know the editor. You should definitely.
And what about reading them? Because I think there is this idea that academic literature, like it's how do I put this?
Inaccessible.
It's inaccessible. Exactly. It's inaccessible and it's too hard for me to read. And I don't, but there's so much value in it, I think.
I think it can be inaccessible because we are writing for other academics. But I think I would welcome anybody to read academic articles especially about adoption. I think the very first stuff when I really got into trying to figure out how I felt about adoption was reading academic articles and reading like academic monographs about the history of adoption and learning stuff. And the great thing nowadays is they're a lot more available online and on online bookstores to purchase and stuff. So I think if you're interested, you definitely should.
All right. Well, what did you want to recommend to us today?
I highly recommend the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Cultures conference in Winnipeg, Canada, which will be happening in 2021 this year in September. And we'd really love to all see you there. We accept art. I chaired an art panel. That was the coolest thing ever. I really had to struggle to find like what to ask them, but it was like musicians and artists, people just talking about their art. So if you're an artist, you can come. If you're a creative writer, definitely submit a panel. And if you're an academic, even just a little bit interested, definitely come. They're super supportive to early career scholars. I told a senior scholar in the field about how I was told I couldn't write about adoption in medieval literature because I was too close to the topic. And she said, "Oh dear, all research is me search." And that really, really made me feel good. Because if you're passionate, how are you going to sustain research if you don't feel a little bit invested in it? And I met my first person that I met on Twitter that I met in real life. I met at ASAC conference. I met Orfea Negra, or Amandine Gay, who's a adoptee and a film documentarian at that conference. It was very funny. I was just like, do we know each other? Oh, you're okay. Yeah. So it's a great conference and definitely go to it. And if you see me there, come say hi. I'm on the board for the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture. So come talk to me. I get very nervous at conferences. So if you come talk to me, I'll definitely talk to you, and I'll be very, very extroverted because that's how I deal with being nervous.
And you're accessible. It's not inaccessible to the regular person.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And of course, ASAC is the organization behind the journal Adoption and Culture. And you can find more information I'll put in the show notes about the conference. And then also you can find the journal. The web address is jstor.org/journal/adoption culture. And as Emily mentioned, you can find those things online. You can read the journal articles with subscription. And yeah, it's just, man, there's just a really wealth of information there. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I really appreciate hearing your story. And wow, can you talk comics? Love that. Where can we connect with you online and perhaps ask you some more questions about comic books since you love them so much?
You can reach me on Twitter at PHUSAZA, which is my that's my username on Twitter, and you can find me there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Emily. Oh, thank you so much for spending this time with me and Emily and listening to our conversation. I'm so glad you could join us. I would love to have your support. If you would share this episode with another adoptee that you know would find Emily's expertise on this topic fascinating. If you would share this episode with them, it would just mean so much to me. Sharing it with just one person is a free way that you can support the podcast. If you want to go one step further, come join us on Patreon. adopteeson.com/partner has all the details. We are doing a adoptee-focused book club this year, and we are reading together a different adoptee-authored book every single month. We are having some book club chats with the authors, which is really, really fun, and some with just us adoptees. So you can say whatever you feel like. And I'm really enjoying seeing our community build through reading. So if that sounds interesting to you, head over to adopteeson.com/partner. And so I have people join Patreon all the time and also leave. People will support for whatever length of time. And then they have an opportunity to do an exit interview. And I was reading them a couple days ago, which, for better or worse, why do you do that to yourself, right? Does it just hurt your feelings? And most of the time people just say, oh, my financial situation changed, which of course, no problem. But one of the ones that was recently, this listener just said, it's too much. I can't keep up. So if you really want more podcasts in your ears, apparently there's just too many over on adopteeson.com/partner. So we'd love to have you join us, and you don't have to listen to everything if you don't want to. Anyway, I am really glad to be back. I hope that you had a restful holiday. I hope that you are taking good care of yourself, and I'm really pleased that you decided to spend some time with me today. So thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.